the man who promised to be my ultimate safe space, the one who swore he would protect me from a world that terrified me, was currently ducking behind a rack of leather purses just so he wouldn't have to be seen standing next to me. How do you survive when the only person you trust, the one you crossed an ocean for, turns out to be the very person trying to break you down? I didn't know it then, but that humiliating, suffocating moment in the middle of a crowded store was just the beginning of a years-long psychological trap. A trap designed to keep me small, hidden, and constantly questioning my own sanity. And the absolute worst part? I walked right into it, completely willingly, believing I had finally found someone who loved the darkest parts of me. To really understand how I ended up frozen in GK more of that store, feeling like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room, you have to understand who I was before him. If you've GGK experienced severe, paralyzing social anxiety, it is incredibly difficult to explain. It's not just feeling shy or GGK butterflies in your stomach before a presentation. It is a loud, ringing alarm in GDK hours a day. It's the physical sensation of hundreds of invisible eyes burning into your skin the second you step outside your front door. For years, I was essentially housebound. My entire world was reduced to the four walls of my bedroom. I only spoke to a handful of family members, and any friends I had existed entirely within the glowing borders of my computer screen. The outside world was a sensory nightmare, and my own body felt like a prison. I had battled a severe eating disorder for years, an agonizing cycle that ravaged my physical health and left me carrying extra weight, which only fed the monster of my social anxiety. My self-esteem didn't just hit rock bottom, it didn't exist at all. I had gone through such a dark, deeply depressing period that I completely stopped taking care of myself. My hair became matted from neglect, my skin was pale from never seeing the sun, and the issues I already had just compounded, breeding entirely new insecurities. When I absolutely had to leave the house, I relied on my armor. I never stepped foot outside without an oversized, baggy hoodie and a face mask. Long before masks were a common sight in public, I wore one like a shield. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to be a ghost. The hoodie hid the body I hated, and the mask hid the face I couldn't bear to look at in the mirror. They were my coping mechanisms, the only things keeping me from having a full-blown panic attack in the middle of the sidewalk. And then I met him. We met online, in the safe, anonymous spaces of the internet where I spent all my time. At first, it was just casual conversation, but soon we were talking for hours on end. For years, he was the voice on the other end of the screen that made the crushing weight of my isolation feel a little lighter. I was completely transparent with him. I hid nothing. I told him about the eating disorder, the weight gain, the matted hair, the depression that kept me in bed for days. I told him about the suffocating social anxiety. I told him that I couldn't go to the grocery store without wearing a massive hoodie and a mask, and how terrified I was of people just looking at me. His response? It was everything I had ever dreamed of hearing. He told me he accepted me. No conditions, no judgment. He listened to my tearful confessions and responded with nothing but warmth and validation. He told me he didn't care about the mask, or the oversized clothes, or my weight. In fact, he claimed he completely understood. He told me stories of his own struggles, how he used to wear a hoodie and sunglasses indoors because his own anxiety was so bad. He painted this beautiful, comforting picture of two broken people who just understood each other. He told me all the things we would do together once we finally met, how he would hold my hand in public so I would never have to feel afraid again. He was intensely affectionate, sometimes heavily sexual to the point of being a little pushy, but he made me feel desired. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, accepted, and loved exactly as I was. He was my sanctuary. So, when the time finally came to meet in person, I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. I fought through the terror, the shaking hands, the sleepless nights, and the nauseating anxiety because I believed with every fibre of my being that my safe space was waiting for me on the other side. But the moment we actually met in person, the illusion shattered so quickly it left me with whiplash. The man who had spent years telling me how much he wanted me, who couldn't wait to hold me, suddenly seemed terrified to even be near me. All those sweet promises of holding my hand to calm my nerves, gone. When I reached for him, he pulled away, Sud claiming he despised public displays of affection. He blamed it on his own insecurities, saying he felt weird about himself. But the way his eyes darted around, checking to see if anyone would get different story, told her completely he didn't want to do any of the things we had spent years dreaming about online. The warmth and obsession he showed over text vanished, replaced by this cold, distant, hyper-vigilant stranger. I could feel the embarrassment radiating off him. I was still struggling heavily, of course. I still avoided eye contact, I still mumbled, and I still desperately needed him to be the bridge between me and the rest of the world. But when I asked him to speak for me, to just ask a simple question in a store because my throat had completely closed up with panic, he flat out refused. Which brings me back to that moment in the store. I had frozen up. I needed to know something about an item, but the words wouldn't come out. I looked to him, silently pleading with my eyes for him to just step in, like he promised he always would. Instead, he stepped back. A store employee, a friendly-looking woman, noticed my hesitation and started walking toward us to see if we needed help. The moment she took a step in our direction, he panicked. He literally turned his back on me and fast walked away, ducking behind a large rack of purses, completely abandoning me. I stood there, trembling, drowning in my baggy hoodie and mask, utterly alone, while the woman asked me a question I couldn't answer. I eventually stumbled out of that store, my face burning so hot beneath my mask I thought I might pass out. When I finally found him waiting outside, safe from the perceived horror of social interaction, he didn't apologize. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just brushed it off. Not long after that, we walked into a Hollister. If you have any kind of sensory processing issues or anxiety, you already know that store is a nightmare. The music is deafening, the lights are impossibly dim, and the smell of cologne is so thick you can practically taste it. I was clutching my sleeves, trying to keep my breathing steady, but before I could even process my own rising panic, he was the one who broke. He looked around wildly, practically begging me to let him wait outside. He bolted out the door, and when I finally caught up to him, his excuse was completely baffling. He looked me dead in the eye and said that where he was from, men simply didn't go shopping with their girlfriends. It was such a bizarre, flimsy lie, but I was so desperate to hold on to the man I had fallen in love with online that I forced myself to swallow it. But the coldness between us was impossible to ignore. Online, he had been intensely sexual, constantly steering our conversations into deeply intimate territory, pushing boundaries and making me feel like he was starving for my touch. In person? Nothing. He was like a wall of ice. He wouldn't hold my hand, he wouldn't initiate physical contact, and he actively turned down any advances I made. My mind immediately started doing what it always did. It turned the blame inward. It had to be my fault. It had to be the fact that I was overweight. It had to be the baggy hoodie that swallowed my frame or the mask that hid my face. I sat down with him, tears welling in my eyes, and asked him if it was me. Was he disappointed? Was I too broken, too ugly, too strange for him to actually love in the real world? He swore up and down that it wasn't me. He acted almost offended that I would even suggest such a thing, assuring me that his lack of intimacy was entirely his own issue. But in the exact same breath, he started gently, persistently pushing me to take off my mask. He urged me to ditch the hoodie. He told me he wanted me to come back to the United Kingdom with him, but to do that, I needed to get my passport, which meant I had to show my face, I had to exist in the world without my armor. And here is where the manipulation became so incredibly confusing. Because mixed in with all the rejection were moments of profound, undeniable tenderness. Because of my severe depression, I had neglected myself to the point where my hair was deeply matted. It was a physical manifestation of my mental illness, something I was intensely ashamed of. But he didn't recoil. He actually sat down and painstakingly helped me untangle it. He was gentle. He was patient. In those quiet moments, I saw the ghost of the man from the internet, the one who promised to take care of me. And it was exactly those breadcrumbs of kindness that kept me hooked. I was determined to be the woman he wanted. So, I relapsed. The eating disorder I had battled for years roared back to life with a vengeance. Before we even met in person, I had managed to lose a significant amount of weight, though I was still slightly overweight. But fueled by his physical rejection and my own desperate need for his validation, I starved myself. I lost weight so rapidly that within a very short time I had reached what doctors would call a healthy weight. But there was nothing healthy about my mind or my body. I was running on fumes, completely hollowed out. But I thought, surely now he will want me. Surely now I am good enough to be seen with. With my new body, my untangled hair, and my freshly printed passport, I boarded a plane and followed him across the ocean to the UK. I left the only safe space I had ever known, entirely trusting him to be my anchor in a foreign country. But the geography changed, and nothing else did. Even in his own territory, he continued to reject me sexually. He still flinched at the idea of public displays of affection. And worse, he started aggressively pushing me to interact with his family, entirely on his terms. Meeting a partner's family is nerve-wracking for anyone, but for someone with my level of social anxiety, it felt like standing in front of a firing squad. Instead of supporting me, he became my director. He would literally feed me lines, dictating exactly what I should say and how GK say it before we walked into a room. Every time he did this, my anxiety spiked so high my mind would jet go blank. When I inevitably froze or stumbled over my words, he would sigh, clearly frustrated and embarrassed by me. The only saving grace was his grandmother. She was incredibly sweet, going out of her way to carry the conversation and make me feel welcome. His mother, however, was a completely different story. She was quiet, hard to read, and immensely intimidating. Instead of helping me navigate this dynamic, he used it as a weapon. Whenever we argued, he would threaten me with his mother's wrath. He would tell me she was in a bad mood, that she randomly called him names, and that I better watch my step. It terrified me. It completely destroyed any chance I had of forming a bond with her, making me avoid her like the plague. I was living in a constant state of walking on eggshells, but I was still trying. I was really, genuinely trying to be brave for him. One evening, we were downstairs in the kitchen making dinner together. It was a rare, quiet moment of normalcy. He casually mentioned that his younger brother's ex-girlfriend, who stayed the night quite frequently, could be coming downstairs at any moment. I had been actively avoiding her because my anxiety around women my own age was particularly severe. He warned me she would probably try to talk to me. Normally, I would have panicked and run back up to the safety of our bedroom. But I took a deep breath. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, trying to ground myself, and I looked at him. I told him that I doubted she would actually try to engage with me, but if she did, I would try to talk to her. It was a massive step for me, a huge, monumental victory in my mind. I was finally choosing to stay and face my fear instead of fleeing. He looked at me, his eyes cold and hard, completely devoid of the pride I expected to see. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a word of encouragement. Instead, he pointed toward the door and demanded that I leave the room. His demand hit me like a physical blow. The absolute shock of it sent a wave of dizziness straight to my head. I had just offered to do the one thing he had been begging me to do for months: to stay, to speak, to try to act normal around the people in his life. And his response was to banish me from the room like a misbehaving dog before I could even embarrass him. I didn't fight him. I didn't even argue. I just turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs, and walked upstairs to hide in his bedroom. It was the exact spot he always made me feel guilty for retreating to, but now he was the one shoving me back into the dark. I sat on the edge of the bed for hours, staring at my hands, feeling utterly, completely broken. I had starved myself down to the bone. I had brushed the mats out of my hair. I had crossed an ocean, and yet I was still the punchline to a joke I didn't understand. I was still the secret he desperately wanted to keep hidden, but the psychological whiplash was only just beginning. Around this time, he started taking new medication. He used this as his brand new excuse for his lack of intimacy, claiming it had completely killed his libido. But the reality was staring me right in the face. I had continued to shrink myself, losing even more weight until I barely recognized my own reflection. I completely overhauled my wardrobe, desperately trying to dress in a way that GDC cringed when we GDC for front door together. And suddenly, magically, the medication's side effects disappeared. As soon as I became smaller and my clothes became more acceptable, his interest flared back to life. Out of nowhere, he started initiating public displays of affection. He was holding my hand, touching me, doing all the things he had sworn he detested just weeks prior. It was deeply disturbing because it confirmed my worst fear. It had always been about my body. His anxiety about PDA was nothing more than embarrassment over my weight and my baggy clothes. He only wanted me when I fit into a specific, shrinking mold. But even with my new appearance, the criticism of my anxiety only intensified. He wanted a shiny new girlfriend to show off, but he was infuriated that my mind hadn't magically healed along with my body. We were out in public one day and I was struggling. I still needed him to act as my buffer. When spoken to by cashiers or store employees, my throat would close up, and I would instinctively look to him to fill the silence. It wasn't malicious, it was pure, unadulterated panic. But instead of quietly helping me, he snapped. He told me that my freezing up made us both look incredibly stupid. He hissed that people were giving us dirty looks because of me, and that my anxiety was directly triggering his own. He decided right then and there to implement a new rule. He flat out refused to go into any stores with me until I forced myself to speak to someone on my own. It felt like I was drowning, and he was standing on the shore, refusing to throw a life preserver until I learned how to swim perfectly. But I was so desperate to please him, so terrified of losing the tiny scraps of affection he had started throwing my way, that I did it. I walked up to a woman in a store. I forced the words out of my mouth. I stumbled slightly, my voice shaking, but I did it. I completed the transaction entirely on my own. When I walked back to him, I felt a genuine, rare surge of pride. I looked up at him, smiling behind my mask, and told him how proud I was of myself for pushing through the panic. He looked at me, gave a tight nod, and said, "I'm proud of you too." But he couldn't just leave it at that. He couldn't let me have a single moment of victory. A split second later, the other shoe dropped. He leaned in and whispered, "But you know, that woman with the mask on? She frowned at you while you were talking." All the air left my lungs. The fragile pride I had just built shattered instantly, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. Why would he say that? Why would he take a magnifying glass to my deepest insecurity right after I told him I felt proud? I asked him why he felt the need to tell me that, to completely derail my progress. He just shrugged, looking genuinely indifferent, and said he didn't know. But it wasn't an isolated incident. That exact same day, we were standing near an ATM. Two guys were standing a little ways off, laughing together about something completely unrelated. I barely registered them through the fog of my anxiety, but he made sure I did. He tapped my arm, pointed them out, and told me, completely deadpan, that they were laughing at me. I snapped. I finally, genuinely snapped. The exhaustion of constantly questioning my reality boiled over into anger. I told him he was intentionally trying to make me feel small. I told him he was feeding my paranoia on purpose. Instead of reassuring me or apologizing, he did the absolute worst thing you could do to someone with severe social anxiety in a foreign country. He turned around and walked away. He literally ditched me in the middle of a crowded city, standing completely alone in a bustling city street, 1,000 miles from home, with my heart racing so fast it felt like it was going to tear through my ribs. I genuinely thought I was going to die. My vision blurred. The noise of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the blaring sirens, it all combined into a deafening roar that swallowed me whole. I don't even remember how I made it back to the small apartment we were staying in. I just remember the sheer, unadulterated terror of navigating a foreign world without the one person I thought was my anchor. When I finally burst through the door, my chest heaving, he was sitting on the couch as if nothing had happened. He didn't look up with concern. He didn't rush to hold me. He just watched me completely fall apart. After that day, something inside me broke, but not in the way he wanted. The desperation to please him morphed into a grim, exhausting determination just to survive. As the months dragged on, I forced myself to talk to more people. Every interaction felt like peeling off a layer of skin. I would push through the anxiety, smile behind my mask, and attempt to act normal, but my progress was never enough for him. Whenever I managed to have a semi-successful conversation, he would meticulously pick it apart. It was a terrifying pattern. Nearly every single time I struggled or stumbled over my words, the interaction involved another woman, and he made absolutely sure I knew it. I remember one specific incident vividly. I had been speaking to a young cashier who seemed completely disinterested and somewhat rude. I tried my best, but when the transaction was over, I instinctively went quiet, assuming our brief interaction had reached its natural end. I gathered my things, hands trembling, and turned back to him. He didn't miss a beat. As soon as we were out of earshot, he leaned in and muttered, "You know that girl gave you a really funny look when you just stopped talking, right?" It happened twice. Twice he deliberately planted the idea in my head that other women found me strange, awkward, and off-putting. He would complain endlessly about how incredibly awkward my interactions were, completely validating my deepest, darkest fears that I was an alien in a human world. The anxiety surrounding his grandmother became a constant, looming shadow. She was the one person in his family who actually tried with me. But because he had made my anxiety such a massive, glaring issue, I became terrified of ruining her perception of me too. He kept pushing me to visit her with him over and over again. Every time he asked, my stomach would tie itself into knots, and I would decline. Eventually, the guilt became too much. I finally caved. I told him I would go. I gathered every ounce of courage I had, visualizing the visit, mentally preparing for the small talk, the tea, the pressure. I was ready. But the moment I said yes, he completely flipped the script. Suddenly, there was a reason we couldn't go. Suddenly, the timing was wrong. Suddenly, he was too tired, or she was too busy, or he just didn't feel like it. He backed out. And he didn't just back out once. Nearly every single time I finally worked up the nerve to accompany him to his grandmother's house, he found an excuse not to take me. He only ever went when he could go entirely alone. It was a maddening, gaslighting cycle. He demanded I integrate into his life, but the second I agreed to step out of the shadows, he slammed the door in my face. The whiplash didn't stop there. When it came time to visit my family, some of whom I hadn't seen in many, many years due to my isolation, the dynamic completely shifted again. Being back around my relatives triggered a massive wave of anxiety. I reverted back to my quiet, shrinking self. I barely spoke, overwhelmed by the pressure of performing for people who remembered the old, vibrant me from before the eating disorder, and the agoraphobia completely took over my life. Instead of supporting me through an incredibly difficult reunion, he made it entirely about himself. He complained bitterly that I wasn't speaking enough. He complained that he was forced to do all the heavy lifting in conversations with my own family. Worse, he complained that I was relying on him to speak for me, telling me how utterly embarrassing and awkward it was to be my mouthpiece. I took his criticism to heart, just like I always did. During our second visit with my family, I pushed myself to the absolute breaking point. I talked more. I engaged. I forced laughter. I masked my panic so well I almost convinced myself I was okay. And still, he complained. It didn't matter what I did. The goalposts were constantly moving. And then, the ultimate betrayal began to unfold. After years of fighting my eating disorder, my body naturally began to recover. The extreme, unhealthy weight loss I had forced upon myself to win his affection was unsustainable. I slowly regained the weight. Almost immediately, his interest in me vanished. The affection stopped. The physical touch ceased. He was suddenly a ghost again. When I confronted him, tears streaming down my face, he blamed it on the medication again. He looked me straight in the eye and swore up and down that it had absolutely nothing to do with my weight. He promised me he had never, ever cared about my size, but the mask finally slipped. When my body returned to the exact weight it was when we first met in person, the weight he had claimed to love and accept online, he completely snapped. During a heated argument, he threw the truth right in my face. He told me I had completely let myself go. He hurled insults at my body, at my appearance, repeatedly tearing me down with a viciousness that left me breathless. The man who had promised to be my safe harbor was actively trying to drown me. When he finally admitted out loud that my weight disgusted him, the entire foundation of our relationship crumbled into dust right before my eyes. Everything he had ever told me about loving my mind and my soul over my physical body was a carefully constructed lie. Looking back, the signs had always been there, glaring at me like neon warning signs I had actively chosen to ignore. A few years prior, when I had first reached the weight I was at when we initially met online, the weight he had supposedly fallen in love with, his entire demeanor changed. He suddenly stopped wanting to go to any of the places we used to frequent. The comfortable, easygoing guy I knew vanished, replaced by someone who was constantly on edge, his eyes darting around every time we stepped out the front door together. He acted exactly like he did when we very first met in person, hyper-vigilant, embarrassed, and desperate to put physical distance between us. When I asked him why he was acting so strangely, he completely gaslit me. He chalked it entirely up to his own anxiety. He blamed the crowds, the noise, his own internal struggles. Not once did he admit the truth. He was utterly ashamed to be seen with me. By this point, my own anxiety had skyrocketed back to its original paralyzing levels. To cope with the overwhelming shame he had successfully instilled in me, I started wearing my mask again everywhere I went. I needed the physical barrier between myself and the world. He claimed he didn't mind. He insisted he was perfectly fine with me wearing the mask, but in the exact same breath, he would completely undercut that support. He was incredibly quick to assume that every single person who glanced our way was judging me. "They're staring at you," he would whisper, leaning in close so only I could hear. "They think you look stupid." He said it more than once. He told me I looked ridiculous. And yet, the hypocrisy of it all was completely staggering. When he was feeling insecure or anxious, he would wear a heavy jacket indoors, burying himself in the layers just to feel safe. I never once made him feel small for it. I never once told him he looked stupid or that people were staring. But when I pointed out the glaring double standard, he immediately deflected. He claimed it wasn't the same thing at all, completely minimizing my need for comfort while weaponizing his own. His disdain for my coping mechanisms started leaking into every single aspect of our lives. We had to go to the mechanic to pick up a car, a mundane errand that normally wouldn't warrant a second thought. But the moment I grabbed my mask to head out the door with him, his face twisted in annoyance. He flat out told me he didn't want me coming to the mechanic with him if I was going to wear it. I stood there in the hallway, completely frozen, trying to process his demand. A chilling realization slowly washed over me. I had gone to this exact same mechanic with him years ago, wearing my exact same mask. The only difference was that back then, I was significantly smaller. I asked him if his sudden embarrassment was actually about my weight. I reminded him that we had done this exact same errand before, and he hadn't cared about the mask at all. He looked at me blankly, claiming he simply didn't recall the previous visit. He then tried to execute the most convoluted mental gymnastics I had ever witnessed to twist the situation into a twisted compliment. "Actually," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "it's a good thing I don't want you wearing the mask. It proves I'm not embarrassed of your appearance at all. I want you to show your face. I want people to see you." It was an absolutely dizzying attempt to gaslight me into believing his rejection was actually a profound act of love and acceptance. But his acceptance was entirely conditional, and it never lasted. He didn't just criticize the mask, he started relentlessly attacking my clothes. My safe, baggy hoodie, the one I wore to hide the body he so clearly despised, became his new favorite target. He told me the hoodie made it look like I wasn't properly dressed. He claimed I looked sloppy, unkempt, and entirely inappropriate for public. He flat out refused to go into a store with me if I was wearing it. Walking down the street with him became an exercise in pure humiliation. If we walked past a stranger, he would let out a loud, dramatic sigh. When I inevitably asked what was wrong, terrified I had done something to embarrass him, he would quickly assure me it wasn't because of me. But seconds later, he would completely contradict himself. We were standing outside a store, and he absolutely refused to walk inside with me. I asked him why, my voice trembling, and he looked me up and down with utter disgust. "Because you look Muslim," he spat out. "You have the hoodie up and the mask on at the same time. You look ridiculous." The sheer audacity of his cruelty left me completely speechless. He was actively destroying my self-esteem, piece by piece, while simultaneously insisting he was the most supportive partner in the world. He swore he didn't judge my mask, claiming his cruel comments were simply born out of frustration. Yet he would repeatedly badger me to take the mask off, completely disregarding my panic. His reasoning was entirely selfish. He claimed my mask drew too much attention to him and to us as a couple, which in turn triggered his own anxiety. My desperate need for a coping mechanism was completely secondary to his comfort. He was drowning me, and then complaining that my thrashing was splashing water on him. The hypocrisy of his so-called support reached a completely new, suffocating level when we volunteered together. It was a local organisation, something he had been a part of for a while. For me, stepping into that kind of environment was an absolute gauntlet. The sheer amount of people, the noise, the expectation of small talk. It was terrifying. But I wanted to be there. I wanted to try. One afternoon, we were outside the main building. It was cold and I was shivering, clutching my arms to my chest. He casually mentioned that a few of his fellow volunteers had told him I was more than welcome to come inside, wait in the warmth and have a cup of tea. Before I could even process the invitation, before I could even feel the familiar spike of anxiety, he snatched the choice right out of my hands. He looked at me, gave a dismissive little laugh, and told me he didn't even bother telling them yes because he knew I'd never take them up on the offer. He said my anxiety was too bad. He made the decision for me, painting me as this incapable, fragile creature who couldn't handle a simple cup of tea. But I was so tired of being that person. I was so tired of him defining my limits. So I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and told him I actually did want to go inside. I wanted to wait in the warmth. The moment I said it, his entire demeanor changed. The casual, dismissive attitude vanished, replaced by an immediate, frantic backpedaling. Suddenly, the room they had offered me was in use. Suddenly, the door was locked. Suddenly, he claimed he needed to give them advance notice before I could just walk in. It was a dizzying barrage of excuses, all designed to keep me standing out in the cold. I let it go that day. I was too exhausted to fight. But the next time we were there, the exact same scenario played out. It was freezing, I was miserable, and I told him I was going to try to go inside to wait. This time, his excuses were even more desperate. He told me there were several people inside the room, and that walking in would absolutely trigger my anxiety. He was trying to use my own mental illness as a weapon to keep me away from his friends. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was going to try anyway. I told him I needed to push myself and that I was willing to face the panic if it meant I could finally sit down in the warmth. His response was one of the cruelest things he ever said to me. He looked at me, completely devoid of empathy, and sneered. "If you manage to walk in there and sit with them, I'm going to seriously doubt the validity of your anxiety." He was telling me, to my face, that if I showed even a fraction of strength, if I managed to overcome the very thing he constantly berated me for, he would accuse me of faking my entire illness. I was damned if I stayed outside, frozen and isolated, and damned if I went inside and proved I was stronger than he wanted me to be. I didn't go in. I stood out in the cold, completely defeated. Later that night, when I finally asked him why he fought so hard to keep me away from his fellow volunteers, the truth finally slipped out. He didn't care about my anxiety being triggered. He cared about how my anxiety would reflect on him. He admitted that he didn't want to walk into a room full of people with me because he was terrified I would go mute. He said it would have been incredibly awkward for him if I sat there and didn't speak. He was entirely consumed by the fear of being embarrassed by me. He wasn't protecting me from the room. He was protecting the room from me. And yet, despite this glaring lack of support, he continued to use his grandmother as a pawn in his twisted game of manipulation. Just last year, he started a massive push to get me to visit her with him. We actually managed to go a few times. I would sit there, my heart pounding in my chest, completely consumed by the fear that my quietness, my awkwardness, my sheer inability to make easy conversation was ruining his visit. I voiced this fear to him constantly, and, in true gaslighting fashion, he completely denied it. He assured me over and over again that my anxiety wasn't ruining anything. He swore his grandparents didn't mind my silence, that they actually wanted me there. He painted this picture of a warm, accepting family dynamic that I so desperately wanted to believe in. He even told me he wanted to go more often and that he absolutely refused to go without me. He suggested we could just sit and watch television with them, a low-pressure environment where I wouldn't feel forced to talk. It sounded so safe. It sounded like he finally understood what I needed. But then we took a trip to America to visit my family. And when we came back, the entire script flipped yet again. Something fundamental had shifted in him during that trip. Suddenly, the promises of visiting his grandmother together vanished into thin air. He went right back to actively avoiding taking me anywhere. The shift was jarring. We were supposed to go to his grandmother's birthday dinner at a restaurant, an event I had mentally prepared myself for weeks in advance. But as the day approached, he became incredibly reluctant. He tried to steer the plans entirely away from the restaurant, repeatedly suggesting we just go to the cinema instead. He promised things would change, that we would start going out more. but his suggestions were always incredibly isolating. He only ever wanted to go to the cinema, where we wouldn't have to speak, or the beach, or a deserted park. He entirely avoided taking me into the city or the nearby town where we used to spend all our time. He was hiding me again. It became a suffocating, deeply isolating reality. He was actively constructing a world where I was kept entirely out of sight, tucked away in the dark corners of cinemas or the empty, wind-swept stretches of a beach where no one could look at us. But the most confusing, heart-wrenching part of this isolation was how he weaponized his grandmother against me. Shortly after we had returned from America, and after he had successfully dodged taking me to her birthday dinner at the restaurant, an incredibly bizarre incident happened. He told me he was going to meet up with his grandmother in her car, just to help her with a quick issue she was having with her phone. It was a mundane, 5-minute errand. Out of nowhere, he started asking me to go with him. He didn't just ask once, he asked repeatedly. "Come on, just ride with me," he urged. "It'll be fine." At first, I said no. My social battery was completely drained from the constant, dizzying highs and lows of our relationship. The thought of putting on my shoes, bracing myself for the outside world, and navigating his unpredictable moods was just too exhausting. I told him I'd rather just stay back at the house, but as he was getting ready to leave, a wave of guilt washed over me. This was the grandmother who had always been so sweet to me. This was the woman I was actively trying to build a relationship with. I didn't want to be the antisocial, broken girlfriend who never made an effort. So, at the very last second, right as he was grabbing his keys, I took a deep breath and said, "Wait, I changed my mind, I'll come with you." I expected him to smile. I expected him to be relieved, or proud of me for pushing past my comfort zone, just like he always claimed he wanted me to do. Instead, he froze. I watched the colour completely drain from his face. He looked entirely caught off guard, like a deer in the headlights. The invitation he had been pressing on me just moments before suddenly vanished. Without missing a beat, he started talking a mile a minute, aggressively trying to convince me to stay home. "You don't need to come," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the door. "It's really not a big deal. You'll just be sitting there. It's cold out. Just stay here. It's fine." I stood there, completely bewildered, watching the man who had just begged me to accompany him verbally barricade the door. The whiplash was nauseating. I finally stopped him and asked the one question that was burning in my chest. "If you didn't actually want me to go with you, why did you keep inviting me?" He couldn't even look me in the eye. He stared at the floor, shifted his weight and mumbled, "I don't know. I just felt bad." He felt bad. He didn't want my company. He was just throwing me a pity invitation, entirely banking on the fact that my severe anxiety would force me to decline. The moment I called his bluff and showed a sliver of bravery, he panicked. He left without me. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the empty doorway, feeling a profound, sinking sense of worthlessness. But the psychological torment didn't end there. When he finally came back from his quick errand, he didn't apologize for his strange behavior. Instead, he walked through the door already on the offensive. He instantly accused me of trying to make him feel guilty for leaving me behind. He twisted the entire narrative, painting himself as the victim of my emotional manipulation, completely erasing the fact that he was the one who had just orchestrated the entire bizarre charade. Over the next few months, this erratic push-pull dynamic with his grandmother became a rigid pattern. He would go see her several more times, and each time it was painfully obvious he didn't want me anywhere near her. The only exception he made was if he was seeing her inside her actual house, but conveniently, those visits almost never happened. We managed to go briefly on Christmas Eve. A tense, heavily managed interaction where I felt like a prop he was carefully posing. But the true depth of his embarrassment was revealed a little while later. We drove over to her house one afternoon, and I had actually worked up the nerve to go inside. I had mentally rehearsed my greetings. I had prepared my safe, neutral conversation topics. But when we pulled up, she wasn't home. My anxiety instantly deflated into a strange mix of relief and disappointment, and we drove away. Later that exact same day, he found out she had returned. He told me we were going back. We pulled into her driveway once again. My heart started that familiar, frantic drumming against my ribs. I reached for my seatbelt, ready to face the music, ready to be the good, supportive girlfriend. Before I could even press the release button, he put his hand out to stop me. "Actually," he said, his voice entirely too casual, "perhaps you should just wait in the car." I froze, my hand hovering over the seatbelt. "I won't be long," he promised, giving me a tight, dismissive smile before stepping out of the vehicle and shutting the door firmly behind him. I sat there in the passenger seat, wrapped in my baggy clothes, my mask resting in my lap, and I watched him walk up the path and disappear inside the warm, brightly lit house. I told myself it would just be 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. The sun slowly began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the driveway. The temperature inside the car plummeted. I pulled my sleeves down over my hands, shivering, but I didn't dare get out. I didn't dare knock on the door and interrupt, terrified of the absolute fury and embarrassment I knew would be waiting for me if I dared to show my face uninvited. I sat in that freezing, silent car for over 2 hours. 2 hours of staring at the front door. 2 hours of listening to the distant, muffled sounds of laughter and conversation bleeding through the brick walls. 2 hours of realizing exactly what I was to him. I wasn't his partner. I wasn't his equal. I was a shameful, embarrassing secret that he had to lock in a metal box outside so he could go inside and play the role of the perfect, unburdened grandson. I wondered what he told her. I wondered if she asked where I was. Did he tell her I was too anxious to come in? Did he use my mental illness as a convenient shield to hide his own cruelty? I was entirely at his mercy, trapped in the cold, realizing with absolute clarity that the man I had crossed an ocean for didn't just want to hide my anxiety. He wanted to hide me. That freezing, isolated silence in the car became a physical weight I carried for days. I was the dark little secret he kept parked in the driveway, completely invisible, while he lived his life inside the warmth. But the true, horrifying extent of his manipulation became glaringly obvious just a few days ago, right before his grandmother's birthday. He had meticulously planned to see her for her birthday. He told me he was going early in the day. Given our track record, the whiplash of his invitations, and the sheer humiliation of being left in the car for hours, I didn't push. I didn't offer to go. I just mentally braced myself for another day of isolation. The morning of her birthday arrived, and I woke up to a quiet house. He had slept in. He was entirely late for his own rigid plans. My anxiety, always desperate for a predictable routine, instantly kicked in. I looked at the clock, then at him, still tangled in the sheets, completely unbothered. I naturally assumed the entire plan was scrapped. If he wasn't going, I certainly wasn't going to force the issue. So, I didn't get ready. I stayed in my safe, comfortable clothes. I didn't shower. I didn't do my hair. I allowed my nervous system a rare, quiet moment of peace, believing the pressure of an interaction was entirely off the table for the day. I was wrong. Suddenly, hours later, he sprang up and started moving frantically around the house. He completely threw it in my face that he was, in fact, still going to see her. The panic hit me instantly. I needed a shower. I needed time to physically and mentally prepare to leave the house, let alone interact with his family. It wasn't a quick 5-minute process for me. It was an entire ritual just to feel safe enough to step outside the front door. I told him I didn't have time to get ready. I told him I needed to shower. Instead of understanding or taking responsibility for his own chaotic schedule, he exploded. He acted completely offended, throwing his hands up in the air and claiming I should have somehow magically known he was still planning to go, despite him sleeping through the entire morning. He treated my entirely reasonable need for preparation like a massive, deliberate inconvenience to his life. Then came the solution. The compromise that completely broke my spirit. He stopped pacing, looked at me in my comfortable clothes and said, "Fine, I can just meet her at her door. I'll hand her the things and she can come say hi to you in the car." I stared at him, absolutely speechless. He wanted his elderly grandmother, on her birthday, to walk out of her own dead gay, down her driveway, and stand out gay my car window just to say hello dead gay. He wanted to parade me like an animal at the zoo, completely trapped behind the glass. I told him absolutely not. I told him that would look incredibly rude, entirely dismissive of her, and profoundly embarrassing for me. I also knew, deep down, that he didn't actually want a quick interaction at the door. I knew him. I knew he wanted a longer, relaxed visit, completely unburdened by my presence. Desperate to avoid this humiliating car window charade, I tried to offer a genuine solution. I suggested we just go see her yesterday instead, when we actually had the time to do it properly. The next day arrived, and the entire cycle repeated itself with terrifying precision. He woke up entirely too late again. He dragged his feet, completely unbothered, and didn't seem to have any intention of going. My anxiety spiked again, a familiar, sickening roller coaster of expectations. But then, out of nowhere, he announced he was leaving. This time, I scrambled. I threw myself into getting ready. I ignored the shaking in my hands and the knot in my stomach. I pushed past every single alarm bell in my head and forced myself to be the flexible, accommodating girlfriend he demanded. But as I was throwing my clothes on, the criticism started. He paced the hallway, rushing me, entirely complaining about how late we were going to arrive. He was actively creating the crisis, entirely responsible for the delay, and yet he aimed all of his frustration directly at me. An explosive argument immediately ensued. The tension was suffocating. In the middle of his tirade, he pulled out his phone, entirely fed up with me, and called his grandmother. He didn't ask if we could come over. He didn't apologize for being late. He asked her if she would be willing to drive and meet him halfway, in her own car, just to see him. She understandably didn't want to do that. She gently declined, suggesting they just do it tomorrow instead. I was completely baffled. The sheer absurdity of the entire situation was dizzying. When he hung up the phone, I looked at him, my voice completely hollowed out. "Why did you just ask her to meet you in her car?" I asked. "Why didn't you just ask if we could come over to the house, like you were initially planning to do?" He wouldn't look at me. He stared out the window, his jaw clenched, and muttered an excuse so flimsy it entirely insulted my intelligence. "I just didn't feel like going to the house," he mumbled. "I thought meeting halfway would be easier for you." It was a lie. A cold, calculated, transparent lie. He wasn't trying to make it easier for me. He wasn't trying to protect me from my anxiety. He just didn't want me inside her house. He didn't want me sitting on her couch, entirely visible, struggling to make small talk. He didn't want to have to explain my mask, or my hoodie, or my silence. I knew exactly what the real reason was, and it hit me with the force of a freight train. I embarrass him far more in a house, where he can't immediately escape, than I do in a quick, controlled interaction in a car. I finally confronted him about it. The months of isolation, the cruel comments, the sheer hypocrisy, it all boiled over. I asked him directly about the dramatic change in his desire to have me around. I reminded him of all the times he had explicitly promised he wanted me to visit his grandmother, only to later claim my presence was entirely awkward and embarrassing. He looked at me, completely defensive, entirely unwilling to take a single ounce of accountability. "You seem far more anxious now than you did before," he snapped, completely invalidating my reality. "I am exactly the same. I have always been the same." I was entirely transparent from the very first day we spoke online about my struggles, my fears, and my coping mechanisms. I never hid a single thing from him. As I stand here now, looking back at the wreckage of the last few years, a profound, crushing realization has settled over me. I have bent over backwards, starved myself, crossed an ocean, and completely shattered my own boundaries to support his anxiety. I have accommodated his every whim, his every sudden panic attack, his every bizarre demand to hide me away, but he has never, not once, truly supported mine. When his anxiety flares up, I become his protector. When my anxiety flares up, I become his greatest embarrassment. I feel entirely trapped, holding on to a ghost of a man who only ever loved the idea of me, entirely terrified of the reality. If you've ever found yourself sacrificing your own mental health to protect someone who actively uses your deepest insecurities against you, how did you finally find the strength to walk away? If you've ever been the secret kept in the driveway, how did you learn to stop shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's incredibly small world? Let me know in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel for more raw, honest experiences like this one.